Diane? All right, I'd like to call the meeting to order. Agenda item number 1 is the private activity bond allocations for calendar year 2023. I'd like to invite Scott up to report.
Thank you. Good afternoon. The private activity bond volume cap allocation for each state for 2023 is $120 per state times the state population, with a minimum of $358,845,000. Vermont receives the minimum. At the January emergency board meeting, the board allocated $40 million to the Vermont Economic Development Authority, $20 million to the Vermont Bond Bank, and the remaining $298,845,000 to contingency. We have surveyed the issuing authorities and recommending no change at this time. We do recommend a motion at the end of the year. Any unused amount usually is split between the Vermont Housing Finance Agency and the Vermont Student Assistance Corps, and they are able to carry it forward for 3 years, so we lose as little as possible, try not to let it expire. So we do propose a motion pursuant to 32 VSA section 992B that the emergency board hereby delegates to the governor the power and authority to assign or reallocate after December 20th and on or before December 31st, 2023, any unused portion of Vermont's calendar year 2023 private activity bond, including the contingency among and between the Vermont Housing Finance Agency, the Vermont Student Assistance Corps, the Vermont Economic Development Authority, and the Vermont Bond Bank. Any calendar 2023 private activity bond allocations to other eligible recipients will require future emergency board action. And we will survey the authorities before the end of the year and recommend to the governor how to reallocate that if needed.
Any questions for Scott? For motion,
Can I say so moved?
as far as I'm concerned, if you may.
Not repeated? I'll second either.
Any further discussion? All those in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed?
Aye.
Thank you. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you.
I'll move to agenda item number 2, the official state Medicaid report. Nolan, would you like to give us that analysis?
For the record, Nolan Langle with Joint Fiscal Office. This is different.
I know, we're changing that.
I like it. I like it.
You're alone.
What's that?
You're alone.
Oh, okay. But I hate it. My boss hated it. I hate it. You all have the report. I'll keep this brief, and most of the room here has heard this, but I'll still walk through the pieces. As you know, by statute, Joint Fiscal Office and the administration are required to report on the most recent end fiscal year for Medicaid and Medicaid-related expenditures. Report talks about caseload, and we have expenditure information as well as some of the flags that we pay attention to in the coming years around Medicaid. As you also know, there's no action required at this meeting. There will be action required in the January meeting. So this is all informative. The data we have in the report is the most up-to-date data that we have at the time of the report together. As you also know, the impact on the impacts from COVID-19, the public health emergency, continue to impact the healthcare system, and will continue to have impacts for years to come. So we'll continue to be monitoring that. Overall, for fiscal year 23, Medicaid and Medicaid-related expenditures totaled $2.17 billion. This was 2.3% or $52 million below what we budgeted in budget adjustment. However, it was still 9% increase over fiscal year 22. Global commitment and the overall program administration were down, but the pharmacy only and DISH payments were up. DISH particularly was up. It was double what normally it is. Normally it's 22.7 million per year, but this year we did the full cap, 46.4 million to help stabilize hospital providers, as was allowed under Act 3 with budget adjustment. I'm going to just touch upon some of the other themes. One is what's called Medicaid continuous enrollment. We internally been referring to it as redeterminations of Medicaid. As you know, this was passed in the beginning of COVID-19. This ended, the continuous enrollment ended on March 31st as part of the Federal Consolidation Appropriation Act of 2023. So the process of redetermining eligibility in Vermont began in April and is expected to take 12 to 14 months. The non-disabled adult eligibility categories were most impacted by this. Normally, these categories have significant churn on and off the program. However, over the last 3 years, it's been mostly coming on and not coming off because of this program, because of this federal policy. Conversely, the number of people receiving Vermont premium assistance saw significant decreases over the same period. So as the program unwinds, as they've been calling it, we expect to see this sort of flip-flop where the non-disabled enrollment groups will kind of level out. Instead of doing this, they'll just kind of level. And then we expect the Vermont premium assistance folks to start ticking back up again. People start to actually churn off Medicaid onto different programs or onto private insurance. Tied to this was also the enhanced FMAP. As you know, we've been getting $6.2 million since March of 2020. As part of this new federal law, the FMAP will start to wind down. As of April 1st, it went from 6.2% to 5%, and then it went to 2.5%. Sorry, it went from 6.2% to 5%, and then it went down to 2.5% on July 1. It will decrease again on October 1st to 1.5%, and then it will cease altogether at the end of the calendar year. Between fiscal year 2020 and 2023, the increased FMAP resulted in over $300 million in general fund savings in the state. So not insignificant. Some of the other things that we've flagged, clawback, FFIS projected that a 15.9% increase in our clawback in calendar year 24, which could have a general fund pressure of between $3.5 and $6.8 million in fiscal year 24, as well as some base pressures going forward. The IMD phase down, which was part of the new GC waiver, is estimated to be $2.1 million pressure in 24 and $6.4 million in fiscal year 25. There's also, under that same federal law, there's a continuous enrollment for children now for kids on Medicaid and CHIP, and that's expected to be a pressure as well. High-cost drugs continue to be a pressure that DVA and AHS will continue to monitor. Finally, floods. In 3 weeks, it's too soon to fully comprehend, but there could be some impact on caseloads and other human services programs in the long and short term, so we'll continue to monitor. So that's the high end. I was trying to be faster than him, but I guess Scott, I guess
Did you have more data?
true. More of a mouthful.
Any questions for Nolan?
No.
All right. So it's just for me. Thank you. Move on to agenda item number 3, the official state revenue estimate. I'd like to invite Jeff and Tom up to present.
Yeah, it is different. It's nice that the light's coming on you guys. Everybody too. Not that much has changed in the revenue outlook, in part because revenues in fiscal 23 came in really close to what was expected. Across all 3 funds, the revenue miss was 1.2%, about $39 million on a base of $3.2 billion. And the external economic environment is also not radically changed. There are still 3 big things going on. They're sort of shown in the 3 charts, full page charts on page 2, 3, and 4 in the handout. The first one is the major economic problem, which is inflation. And spiking to 9% a year ago, but down all the way to 3% currently. So, but that is the issue around which a lot of the rest of the economy is being driven. So that's the problem. The solution is monetary response that has raised interest rates now 11 consecutive times, 5 basis points to the highest levels in 22 years. And the purpose of this is to slow the economy such that inflation slows down. The third chart is one of the reasons that it's not having the same effect as quickly as it might have in previous situations. The economy has been chugging right along with solid job growth, very low unemployment, continued consumer spending, a lot of business investment too. And GDP that clocked in the last quarter at 2.4%, which is just about potential. So we're not seeing a lot of negative effects in the economy. So there's a lot of momentum to it. It is starting to tail off in some areas that are leading indicators. And it is why fiscal 24 is going to be a year of a fair amount of stress, because the lagged effects from those interest rate increases will be in full force. And so, you know, that has almost always had a very strong material influence on the economy. With all the money that's out there still, and there's a lot of it that's unspent. We'll talk about that in a lot of different aspects of this. There's a tremendous amount of firepower that's still there. There's still a lot of stimulus that's going on at the ground level. And so, you know, exactly what's going to happen with that back and forth, hard to say. If inflation really keeps ticking down, got all the way to 3, I suspect it's going to bounce around. It's not going to go smoothly down to 2, which is the target. There might even be additional interest rate increases. Seems like they might sit pat for a while and see, which is not a bad idea given the lags involved. But it's certainly possible that there could be this ideal slowing of inflation without raising the unemployment rate too much. And that is exactly what being hoped for, but everything would have to go right to make that happen. But last week's economic data suggested, you know, maybe it could. So that's where we stand right now. For revenues, it doesn't represent a big change, but a little bit of upgrading and then adjustments based on individual categories. The biggest item in that is interest income, and we'll talk about that. Jeff, maybe you want to.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. When you consider that the 2023 results, we were up $39.7 million, and we won 1.2% of over $3.2 billion. This should have been a milquetoast forecast upgrade, but it was anything but milquetoast. The economy's been more resilient, obviously, than we expected, but we're expecting a slowdown. And the risk of recession still is very real for some of the points that Tom just made. Inflation is coming down off its high water mark, absolutely, but it still remains too high for us. And it's well above the 2%, or some people now are saying maybe even 2.5% long-term inflationary annual target from the Fed. And so in terms of, you know, we're not out of the woods on the inflation fight yet. I think, you know, Tom and I both agree it's probably going to stay higher and be stickier. In other words, be around for longer. And so as long as monetary policy is in this posture and we continue to have this clash between all the stimulus that still remains, even though it's waning, there's still quite a bit of money out there, not only from the pandemic aid that has been banked, but the minimum allocations that we got for some of the infrastructure money and those kinds of things. So there is still some ammunition to carry the economy forward. But there still is this unusual amount of risk out there that the economy could slow more than what we expect. And that we could tip over. I mean, when you start to slow and you start to get close to the edge, it doesn't take very much. Something geopolitical, something with energy, particularly in Vermont. And now on top of that, in Vermont, we have the floods. So this forecast, update was anything but normal and average. And you can tell by that because my level of anxiety for a forecast is directly related to the length of my report, and this one's 50 pages. Because I feel like I have to explain everything about what's going on. If we look at the numbers, Tom is right, there's a pretty significant upgrade in 24, slows down to 25, but it's still an upgrade, but it's driven by what I call some special factors, not the least of which is net interest. We still have a lot of money in our accounts. It is historically off the charts.
Yeah, just for perspective. So fiscal 21 interest income, both general fund and education fund, 0.9 million, not even 1 million. 2.6 million fiscal 22. The last 45 years, from fiscal 77 to fiscal 22, averaged 3 million. That's why we don't have huge detailed.
7.6 million.
Yeah, we don't have big models, that we crunch around that each time. It's fairly small. This last year, fiscal 23, $56.7 million.
That's C fund and G fund
Yeah,
combined.
combined.
51.2 million in the G fund.
Five and change.
And if you look at the second half, that interest came in the G fund at the rate of over $83 million. And in the Ed fund, it came in at the rate of just over $9.5 million. So when you look and see what's in the 24 number, about 88% of that in the G fund is due to net interest. And it's already baked in. We already have high levels. And now we have high interest rates. And the Treasurer's Office has done a good job of making sure that the people where we put the money are paying us a decent interest rate. So that's why, 2024 is the level it is. It's still elevated in 2025. It comes down to a much higher level than it has been historically, still over $20 million in those out years, because the balances, even though they come down, are still high. We used to carry around $200 to $300 million.
It could fluctuate up to 500, but it was way lower. And it really, if you look at average daily cash balances on page 26, and I think Jeff has the.
I have the exact same chart.
Same chart in his report, but a little bigger on this page because we're using it for virtual stuff. But page 26 chart is average daily balances, and as Jeff said, it bounces around. This starts in 2004, so it bounces around. It can be 200, 300, 400 million dollars, and then pandemic hits, it shoots way up. That gets spent down pretty quickly because there were pretty rigid expiration dates on when you had to spend stuff. But then came additional COVID money, infrastructure money, other monies from the Fed, and also revenues were higher than expected, and also expenses were lower. A lot of vacancies in the state government kept expenses down. The net effect of all of that, the biggest part of it being the federal government money, is that you get this huge increase in cash balances, and then you add to that, Jeff said, the higher interest rates, and all of a sudden, we're forecasting $7 to $9 million in fiscal 24 interest income, about 69 of that in the general fund.
69.2.
Yeah, okay, and then the rest in the education fund. And it will go down pretty quickly to fiscal 26 because there are expirations on that are pinned to that date. But it's still there's a lot of money all of a sudden from this one category. It's the 5th biggest source of revenue in the general fund. All of a sudden out of the blue. So it's great that it's there, but it's not going to last very long. And I actually think, if depending on exactly what happens with both interest rates and various balancing, it could be substantially higher than that. Like Jeff said, the run rate in the second half of fiscal 23 would have been higher, maybe equivalent of something in the 90s rather than 79. So we'll see. It's as a brand new thing. We're just getting data, and the Treasurer's Office has been fabulous in working with us and looking at all the detail where it's deployed and timing. And it's very, very difficult to get the monthlies on this because of the way it's laddered. And, just
Sometimes investment maturities go several months and CDs and all those kinds of things. That's how, even though we went at the annual rate of over $80 million, we actually had a negative monthly number in G-Fund interest in May.
I know.
So anyway, the monthlies might be a little odd, but over the course of the year, it's going to be a substantial amount of money. So that's
Without interest, the G-Fund numbers would read like plus 32.8 for 24, minus 6.8 for 25, minus 9.1 for 26, minus 12.3 for 27, and minus 12.8 for 28. So that's how significant net interest was, or it and still is now that we're in this world.
Yeah, so the overall change from January in the general fund is 78.3. There's a 5-year chart on page 24.
I have the same,
You have that one? Okay, all right, good. So we both have this one. There's only 2 years by statute that we forecast, but for a long time, Jeff and I have just been doing this.
planning numbers.
Yeah, as a planning exercise gratis, and it's useful in a period like where this interest income goes down and things like that to see beyond 2 years. And I think probably more and more for planning purposes, it's important to go out farther, even though the reliability as you get farther out goes down. It gives a picture based on the assumptions that are included. But the adjustment is 78.4 million higher than we said in January. But keep in mind that's still a decline in fiscal 24 relative to 23. So
It's still much higher than we were seeing pre-pandemic.
way more than pre-pandemic. It's a whole different universe. So yes, absolutely. Yeah. And most of the change in the transportation fund comes from the fee bill changes. So that's, but the tax base there is not growing hardly at all. I mean, a lot of it's demographically pinned, and there's not a lot of growth there. So unless you do something like adjust a rate, there's not going to be a lot of growth there. And the education fund benefits from its connection to consumption taxes, which are not as cyclical. It's things like personal income and corporate. That's what's really driving the cyclicality of the general fund, and the fact that it's getting more interest also. It's a smaller part of it, but it's getting some interest in there too. But these are fairly minor changes. Again, with a total of billion, this is a level of change, not a lot that's happening.
Same charts on page 8.
We did consider the potential economic impacts from the flooding, but it occurred about a week after we finished the macroeconomic forecast. And it takes a lot of data detail to really model that properly, because like the pandemic, you have impacts that are negative. And then if you have federal government offsets and insurance offsets and things like that, you have to also track that and balance those. So the hit initially is to property and wealth, and there's only one wealth tax revenue source that we have really of any issue, so the property tax, and that's not something that's forecast here. We do that in October, but there's a tremendous loss of wealth, but as that gets rebuilt, you get flows that actually can sometimes be higher than they would have otherwise been if the event is insured. And that's not always been the case in Vermont. In 1927, the flooding had very minimal amount of federal money that was offset, and it took a very long time for the state to self-fund and recover from that. There was a very early event going back even further in 1821, the southern part of the state, a flood that was severe enough that whole communities pretty much disappeared. People left, and would vacate an area rather than, deal with rebuilding.
Probably not a solution now, but.
No, but I mean, actually, when you look at economic impacts, if you don't have that offset, there's all kinds of terrible stuff that happens. And the worst of which is eventually population relocation. And actually, there are some more recent events that have had that. Some of the hurricanes, Katrina in particular, had some areas where people actually physically moved out. We've done work for the Army Corps of Engineers in Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi, looking at some of those issues. But net, if there's a lot of federal money there, it's not a slam dunk that the impact on revenues, not in the first quarter or so, but over the course of even one fiscal year, but especially multiple fiscal years, it's not a slam dunk that it will necessarily be net negative. So we look forward to getting data.
Double negatives in that last sentence.
Yeah.
Okay, well then maybe let's reduce it to one. It might be.
It's
positive.
likely this is going to be a positive.
Not
No.
necessarily likely. We don't have the data to
Possible.
say that. It's possible. And so don't assume, one might assume that it would be negative. It's a
All
terrible
negative.
event. Awful things happen. There's obvious loss of property, business opportunity, all this stuff. It might not be when we're talking revenues because of the impact of that outside money. That's all. And we need more data before we can do credible modeling.
Although FEMA money is a little bit different than the COVID financial aid and some of the other stuff that we got, because FEMA money doesn't necessarily make the people who suffered big losses whole, or by any stretch of the imagination.
Right.
So there's also some differences there, but if you look at the literature on California wildfires and all those and other wildfires in Mexico and places like that, the recovery efforts do get the economy overall on a higher plane several years down the line. But there are groups that do better, and then there are groups that still lose a lot. So there's an awful lot going on here. Without a federal financial aid paradigm like we had with COVID, where they were trying to make everybody whole from the business interruption, stuff like that, FEMA is not anywhere near like that. And that's assuming that they get refunded after they run out next month.
We heard some testimony by Kristen earlier with Joint Fiscal that was starting to, scope out the parameters of the losses and the magnitude of the loss. And we need much more complete information along those lines. And so we'll take a look at that when it comes in. She also said that I think they just recently got the last check that had to do with Irene.
Yeah.
So that's 12 years. And, that's the kind of timeline sometimes we're looking at with this stuff. So it's complicated. I think the one thing that's important takeaway is that it is probably statistically more frequent future event than the data that's being used for flood probability would indicate. So that planning and understanding how to deal with events like this is probably going to be something that it's not like, oh, great, it's once in 100 years. We don't have to worry about that in our lifetimes, but there could very well be another one. So it certainly is something to be thinking about as, as temperatures are warmer, the air can hold moisture, and then it can burst like this and be really problematic and be highly localized too. It's
Something to look forward to.
It's raining now.
yeah, it's really it just doesn't stop. Yeah, this doesn't stop. But anyway, that's how we dealt with it.
There was one kind of optimistic aspect.
Oh,
of the
good.
revenue
Could you
forecast.
please?
And that was when we looked as deep as we can in the time that was allotted under the hood of the corporate income tax, it looks like that our base is diversifying, and that a good amount of kind of the draft in corporate revenues that we've seen is going to stick around. It's still early yet, but it wasn't long ago. I mean, just like I remember the time that we used to have to go out and borrow cash to make the first payday payment because we didn't have a big enough balance to do that. I remember there was a time when corporate income tax at 100 corporations paid 2/3 of our corporate income tax. It was much smaller back then. Now that number is in the thousands. So it's diversifying. I think from unitary tax right up to market-based sourcing, there are companies that always used to pay the minimum tax that now are paying substantial amounts because of the nexus. And so those changes, I think, have put a higher floor under corporate. Not that corporate isn't a highly volatile tax to begin with, and we have to be on guard on that, particularly if we end up in even a mild downturn, that can change liabilities very quickly. And some of the money that we get in these higher estimated payments can go out the door 18, 24 months later, faster sometimes than when they came in. So we have to, but the good news is that it does look like it's a more diversified base, and the floor is higher, but it's still going to go up and down over that floor.
And we were looking at data at a very granular level from fiscal 19 and fiscal 23 to get an idea of sort of before and after both pandemic and this last change to market-based sourcing. And we looked at people that were paying in both of those years. Only about 40% of the payers in fiscal 19 showed up as payers in fiscal 23. But the number of payers went up about 3-4%. So there are more people. But that's an enormous change in who we're getting revenues from. And as Jeff said, there's a much fatter middle or upper middle of corporations that weren't paying before or were paying very little. Generally, with market-based sourcing, it's a very large corporation that is also enormously profitable. So large enough that they're selling into Vermont, but they have such high profitability that even a teeny little apportionment share is a lot of money to us. And it doesn't change their behavior in any way. So that shift doesn't sort of drive a company out of the state, or it's a giant entity. They're selling into what they sell all over the place. They're not going to change their behavior. And yet we get a lot more tax revenue than we did before.
And there's been a time lag in discovery that these companies actually owe money. So we've had
It does look like compliance.
we've had creeping compliance.
That's what I would say. So anyway,
But that's not unusual when you have a major tax.
Surely.
That's not unusual for, we had the same situation with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and the repatriation issue and all that kind of stuff.
yeah, there's a lot that's happened in that period that muddies the water. But as Jeff said, it is really a category that's hyper vulnerable to decline because they're paying forward with estimated payments and it doesn't get trued up until there's a filing, but it's quite often on extension, but there's a lot of money out there and also carry forwards. We found that there's a lot of carry forward money because that explains some of the names that don't show up. Is if you had a really long carry forward in fiscal 19 and you just weren't paying taxes because you had so much of a carry forward, there are a few, that's not many, but anyway, we looked at carry forwards too. But all that can turn the other direction in an instant with refunding. And when interest rates are high, there's even more incentive to not just leave your money out there. It's not earning anything, but rather get it back. And so that's a risk of the category.
And when the penalty to file is like, we could afford it, not to file for not filing, we could afford that. Sometimes, it's surprising who you see hasn't filed their 21 return. paid their taxes, but they haven't filed a return.
So those two sources, interest and corporate, a big part of that's the whole thing will change in the general fund. But corporate is still declining in fiscal 24, but not by as much as we had.
As we originally thought, yeah. We learn every 6 months, we learn.
And the relationship between inflation and corporate revenues.
Well, that
Some
is
pricing power out there.
absolutely, you see it. You see that, and there have been some studies recently also that reiterated that. So margins have fattened, and that's improved corporate profits. And in an environment where their price is going up, some companies have been surprised how much of the price increase sticks. And there's not always an adjustment down when their costs go down. So, that is a part of that environment.
I
It's
like
almost
this
like,
graph. This is really.
yeah, it's like how crazy is all this stuff.
It's like my migraines.
Yeah, but the big part of that, if you look at the red line, that's gasoline on that.
Oh, yeah.
That's a big part of why, it went from 9 to 3%. It's a drop in fuel prices. That really didn't have anything to do with the Fed. That's completely outside. It's not like demand for gasoline dropped because the economy's slow.
And it's heading back up.
And it could head back up.
It's heading back up.
We'll see, but anyway.
What about the relationship between the workforce and corporate revenue in the future? Have you considered that? I mean,
Well,
we continue to be impacted by a lack of workers.
yeah, well, not just that lack of workers also raises the cost of labor. So, it's harder and harder to get people. But it's a bidding war. So if corporations are making a lot of profits and getting a marginal employee is going to be paid for with that, they'll offer more than the next guy and they'll get that employee. If they're not able to pass on their costs, they'll lose in that competition for employees. But I think as long as the labor market's as tight as it is, I think that typically wages are a lagging factor in inflation because people typically maybe get an annual review. It's not like, say your costs go up and you're adjusting price, you can change your prices daily if you want to, or pretty quickly. But wages usually are backward looking. So maybe a year, some contracts are even 2-3 years or more. And so when they get renegotiated, they'll say, all right, we need to catch up because we haven't gotten an adjustment for 2 years or 3 years. That's going to be a big adjustment. And you see that with some of the labor actions, with the strikes and things with organized labor. But even where it's not organized, when things are tight like that, it's bidding up wages. So the cost of labor is going up. And that's another reason I think it's going to be hard to get below, from that 3 to 2, it's going to be a lot harder than 9 to 3. And I don't even necessarily believe in 3. I mean, I think it could bounce around.
We've actually made some progress in adding back to our labor force that we lost during the downstroke from the pandemic. We're about 70% of the way back from the low point, which actually happened about 4 or 5 months before the pandemic downdraft. So we're still a good 6,000-7,000 people in the workforce lower than we were in late 2019. So and we still have 2.5 positions for every unemployed person who's in the workforce. So, and that's still higher than the US, although it's come down. We were running just south of 3.5 jobs for every worker about this time last year. So we're making some progress, but not nearly enough.
1.9% unemployment right now. So
In June, and I believe that number. I mean, the household survey for June was good, but the numbers that came out in the employer job count, the current employment survey, it is, I think I said.
Subject to revision.
Well, I said that, well, actually it was more colorful when Matt Bear was over at the labor, but I called it a horrendous number. It started in May, and there, if you track If you look at how the household survey numbers, which is different, it looks for unemployed workers. It doesn't count jobs because an unemployed worker could have multiple jobs. We cornered the market on that in Vermont. And you see a very tight relationship, except there was some divergence at the bottom of the COVID-induced downturn. But the lines go almost in tandem, and then beginning in May, the household survey number goes up a little bit, and the last 2 months, the count of jobs at businesses go down like that. And if you look at the May to June numbers, seasonally adjusted, and that's where the problem is, we lost 1 in every 5 workers in the private education industry in Vermont. I know that didn't happen. And so I wish our federal partners who are in love with national numbers cared as much about the state numbers as they do about the national numbers. But they use 5-year trends to seasonally adjust data, 5-year numbers. And if you'll recall, we had a little thing called the COVID pandemic in the middle that affected job counts and all those kinds of things. So their reply was, the Fed's reply was, our federal partners was, oh, this will even out after September. Now, I can hardly wait to see the July numbers, which the first round of the floods happened during survey. So it's going to be a wonderful, don't pay attention to the numbers, Governor, for about 6 months.
Yeah, the seasonal adjustment.
Those numbers, not those.
Yeah, those numbers, yeah. Those job count numbers from business establishments called the current employment survey, CES.
But revenue numbers too are going to be a little bit odd because the tax has done a fabulous job dealing with all of this with remote work and the like, but some of the tax stuff has to be processed with paper. So they had to move the whole facility and all that. So that's going to affect, and then of course the extensions on when people can pay, all that kind of stuff. So that's going to skew some of the monthly things, and it could be erratic.
I hope we know more in January.
Need a motion.
Any further questions?
Oh, it's tradition that I move this one, right?
Yes, it's one, yeah, revenue,
Thank you.
item number 3.
The state revenue estimates pursuant to 32 VSA Section 5A for fiscal year 2025 are as followed on this motion below us. You can read the whole thing. Unless you want me to.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any further discussion? All those in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? Let's have it. The motion is passed. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll now move to agenda item number 4, the education fund outlook. And I'd like to have Julia Richter.
Good afternoon. For the record, I'm Julia Richter, with the Joint Fiscal Office. Try to keep it brief today. There's not a motion that's required, but I'm really just updating on the status of the education fund after fiscal year 23 closeout. So as you will recall, Act 52 of 2023 set the property yield at $15,443, the income yield at $17,537, and the uniform non-homestead property tax rate at $1.39.1. And that can all be seen in the education fund outlook that's in your packet. On line C, D, and E, yeah. So as you're likely aware, these yields and rates are estimated to correspond with an average bill change of an increase across all 3 classes by approximately 4.27%. And this increase in the average bill change is in contrast to an estimated average tax rate decrease. And that's primarily due to forecasted grand list growth of 9.7%. So the increase in the average bill change can really be attributed to multiple factors, and those include 8% year-over-year growth in education spending across the state, performance of non-property tax revenues, and new appropriations out of the education fund. You'll also recall that there were some changes to the additional reserves in the education fund. So in addition to setting the yields and the rates, Act 52 also reserved $13 million for offsetting the education property tax rate increases in fiscal year 25. And you'll see that reserve in line 37 of the outlook. Act 78, the big bill, also made some adjustments to other additional reserves in the education fund. So it reserved $9.1 million to fund future supplemental cost of living payments to qualifying retired members and beneficiaries of the Vermont State Teachers Retirement System. And it also unreserved the $32 million in the PCB reserve and then appropriated funds to AOE for PCB remediation and removal grants. You'll see that captured in lines 35 and 30 of the Ed Fund outlook. So all of these things into play and updating the non-property sources, revenue sources from the forecast you just adopted. There's an estimated $24.7 million that is unreserved and unallocated for fiscal year 24, sorry. And you'll see that in line 39.
Any questions? Thank you, Julia. To agenda item number 5, their business. I would like to have Secretary Curley come up. Any questions on the $20 million business emergency gap assistance program?
Hello.
Overview.
For the record, I'm Lindsay Crowe, the Secretary of the Agency of Commerce and Community Development. And here to just really briefly share that we're looking for $20 million to roll out a grant to help businesses who have endured physical damages from the flood dating back to July 7th of 2023. Applicants must intend to restore and reopen and bring their employees back to work. And these grant funds would be, as I mentioned, used to repair physical damages that they encountered from the severe storms. I don't know if you want me to go into details. I know you have the details of the program, so maybe it's easier just to ask questions if you have questions. But I testified a little bit earlier on this, so.
Any questions?
I don't think so. We had a presentation at Joint Fiscal this morning, and we also had the benefit of a joint committees last week having your testimony, and they felt, I think, very positive and around the design and the description. So I think anything more would simply be repetitive. I'm sure you've probably read it.
I have. Is there a motion?
Is there a tradition? Please do. Why don't you do this one? I'll save myself.
Last one, all right. In consideration of the July 2023 flood disaster in Vermont and urgent needs of Vermont businesses, the motion is made, or I move, pursuant to 32 VSA sections 133 parens B and 7062 to transfer up to 20 million of the 30 million total appropriations to the Public Service Department for the Vermont Community Broadband for federal match made in 2022 Acts and Resolves number 185, section B 11 A28, which was added to the 2023 Act 3, Section 45, to the Agency of Commerce and Community Development for the Business Emergency Gap Assistance Program, as described in the attached material. This is in support of businesses affected by the July 2023 flood, as declared in Executive Order 3-23, the Commissioner of Finance and Management shall present a proposal to replace the funds transferred from the Public Service Department appropriation as part of the Governor's 24 budget adjustment proposal. The Secretary of ACCD shall report on the amounts and use of funds distributed by the Business Emergency Gap Assistance Program at the September-November 23 Joint Fiscal Committee meetings. There's got to be a shorter way to say it.
There was, just refer to it, but I'll second your motion.
Any further discussion? All those in favor, signify by saying aye.
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 Those opposed? Ayes have it. The motion is passed. Thank you very much. Now move to the Emergency Financial Assistance Program for flood impacted Vermonters. Commissioner Tierney is on.
There she is.
Line.
There's sunflowers.
Commissioner, could you give us a description of the program and answer any questions?
Yes, Governor, I'd be glad to do that. So the program, which was developed over the weekend with many cooks in the kitchen, is an emergency financial assistance program for flood impacted Vermonters. The purpose of the program is emergency grant funding that will be available to assist Vermont residents, including homeowners and renters who were impacted by the July 23rd, 2023 flood disaster, as declared in the Executive Order 03-23. And these folks need to replace flood damaged and flood destroyed appliances and equipment. Now, current FEMA reports estimate that over 4,000 residences were impacted. We don't know exactly how many of those are necessarily low or middle income, but that is the target audience for this aid, and the emergency funding would support addressing their needs. Efficiency Vermont would be deployed to utilize existing cost-effective programs, supply chain partners, and delivery mechanisms to ensure supply availability. The authority for the department to direct such grant funding to Efficiency Vermont in consultation, I might add, with many other entities that are habitually active in this space anyway, such as Office of Economic Opportunity and the Vermont Housing Financing Authority and the like. Anyway, the power to do so on my end derives from 30 VSA 2E, which is a statute that was enacted many years ago, directing the commissioner to work with these stakeholders to essentially try to get affordable housing off of fossil fuel and to introduce efficiency measures instead. Now, the grant program would be capped at $10 million that would be transferred from $35 million that were appropriated to the department to, in turn, send on to Efficiency Vermont to do weatherization. It would be, as I said, 10 million of that 35 million. And the awards themselves would be not to exceed $10,000 per individual. There would be income qualifications. We would be using Vermont's area median income in keeping with practices that already exist at Efficiency Vermont. And priority would be given to folks with income below 120% AMI. We also are keen to make sure that there is, for lack of a better term, regional distribution equity, meaning not any one community gets all the money because they have the most applications that get it through the door first. But these are program details that we'll have to work out. We are all cognizant of that, and I am pleased to report that we are all pulling in the same direction. Finally, what is also important to know is that I have mobilized the distribution utilities who have Tier 3 obligations that are very similar to what we're trying to do with this program. Tier 3 obligations are essentially to get customers, ratepayers, to adopt energy systems and the like that reduce fossil fuel emissions. So there's a great collaboration underway there, and Efficiency Vermont has been part of those discussions as well. The idea here is that we would stack the awards, or they are stackable with federal tax incentives that exist, other EEU programs and incentives that exist, IRA, Inflation Reduction Act incentives, and any other state-controlled program that is, that is active in the space and that can be deployed to help without cannibalizing to the point where other needs that were already programmed in law go unmet. So for instance, we all know there's a terrible, terrible need out there to weatherize buildings. And the judgment that we can take 10 from 35 million is a solid judgment. I would be hesitating if we go much farther, because any contractor will tell you when you're trying to address both efficiency and decarbonization, starting with the envelope of the building is the way to go. And that is what weatherization is all about. So that's where we are in the program development. Are there any questions I can answer for this committee?
Not quite a question, but I just like to say that I'm very glad that we've all been able to move so quickly to both address the needs of businesses today and the needs of individuals who both have significant costs ahead of them, probably over and above what FEMA's going to be able to supply to us. So I'm just glad that we were able to move slightly faster than the usual pace of business to respond to the needs of the community.
I guess I would second that. A number of the cooks are sitting right around here to put this together. And I think everyone was feeling that certainly the business grants were important money in the pocket, but also when we were thinking about particularly in Barry, the housing stock that was impacted and what that means for families with lower incomes. There's a need there. So this way of transferring an existing appropriation toward this end just seemed to make sense. And I'm glad to hear the commissioner say it's a good balance between the weatherization needs and the emergency needs. So I think we're very appreciative that we can move this fast. And
it is not, I'm sure, the last of the needs we're going to be asked to fill.
So I will move that the authority to transfer these 10 million from the 35 million as outlined in the written motion here be accepted.
There's a second. Any further discussion? All those in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
The ayes have it, and the motion is passed. I do wanted to thank everyone for bringing this forward to our attention. Obviously, going out throughout Vermont and seeing the devastation again with businesses impacted, but there's always in every business there's a human behind that, and that's our workers, and we need to support them as well. And you're absolutely right. None of this will be anywhere near enough. And we're going to be challenged by this. The match that we're going to have to provide for FEMA, as well as some communities, some individuals aren't going to, or we may not make it to the threshold. Extremely, and I'm talking, looking at Representative Lampier now, because Addison County hasn't qualified for individual assistance at this point. We need people from that county to report any damage as soon as possible. Call 211 or go online and make sure that you're reporting your damage, because that makes a difference. It made a difference in Orleans County last minute.
In Addison?
We don't get those numbers, but we monitor it through 211, and we have a ways to go. And so all those who are impacted will not get that individual assistance, and it will hurt the whole county.
But what we just did here does help, even if it's not designated by FEMA. So there is some benefit here.
Right, to replacement of systems.
I
But
realize it's
but it
not as
doesn't,
much.
yeah, it doesn't help with a house repair or driveway or a vehicle that's it's been flooded and so forth. So again, that individual assistance would would really help us out a lot, and especially in those, look at Ripton, when you see the slide there and all the damage that was done, that won't qualify for individual assistance. So again, we have our work cut out for us. But I think, again, with all of us working together, we'll get through this. Is there any other further business to discuss? Entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
All those in favor,